America was built on slavery. This has become a standard trope of critical race theory. It is something that is taught in our schools. It is something that has now surfaced on a Disney show called The Proud Family. It's a kind of a cartoon show, but weaved into it are themes of slavery and reparations. And I want to just quote a line or two. This country was built on slavery, which means slaves built this country. It goes on to talk about why that creates a foundation, a moral foundation for reparations. Now, this may seem like inarguable, which is to say self-evident. I want to argue that's one of those things that we tend to take for granted so much that it takes a little bit of thought and scrutiny to realize that it's not true. What is not true? This country was not built on slavery, and slaves didn't build it. And think of how if what I said is true, it blows the foundation for reparations right out of the water. The premise itself is false. But how can it be false? Didn't slaves, at least some would say, well, they certainly helped to build this country, didn't they? And I would say, in a sense, no. And the reason I say no is because it's not that the slaves didn't do any building. Slaves, of course, there was some slavery in the North also before the American founding. Most of slavery was either abolished or on its way to being abolished in the era of the American founding. And then slavery became more regional. It was in the South, mainly plantation slavery, small and large plantations. Okay, so the slaves built the plantations. But what happened to the plantations in the Civil War? They were destroyed. They were leveled to the ground. Sherman burned Atlanta. So at the end of the Civil War, what was left in the South was very little. Just land, agriculture. The South had to sort of rebuild its way out of, a kind of rubble. So what the slaves built was destroyed during the Civil War. And the idea that America today is somehow built by slavery is, I think, nonsensical. Now, it's tempting for people to go from there to say, well, all right, but what about the immigrants, Dinesh? Didn't the immigrants build America? No, they didn't either. Now, I'm not saying that the immigrants, again, didn't do anything, they didn't work, but the country was built by the original European settlers. They are the ones who established the economic and political and moral foundations for a strong, prosperous, and decent nation. And then this is me tweeting, we are all living off the fruits of their labor. Now, I knew when I said this, it would sort of set off a little bit of a social media stir. And sure enough, I get all kinds of comebacks. And one of these comebacks is, well, Dinesh, the settlers are the same as immigrants. You're talking about settlers, but didn't the settlers come from another country? Doesn't this make them immigrants? No. Settlers are not the same as immigrants. There's a real difference between a settler and an immigrant. I put it this way. The settler is the guy who shows up and builds the country. He's the first guy to actually create the recipe for a society. Now, if it happens to be a good society, good recipe, good society, then immigrants will leave their own country and move voluntarily to the better country that the settlers have created. In other words, immigrants move to already existing established societies because they like the way that society is run or organized. But who organized it? Not the immigrant, the settler. And this is why the countless immigrants who have come to America over the generations, me included, all of us owe a great debt to the Pilgrims and to the original settlers. They are the ones, more than anyone else, more than the immigrants, more than the slaves, they are the ones who really built America. Now, once I establish propositions that are hard to argue against, I get quibbles. And here's a quibble that comes from somebody on social media. Hey, Dinesh, care to weigh in on the assertion that European settlers weren't immigrants? I'm sure lots of First Nation leaders, meaning Native Americans, would have a different interpretation of history. And here I make the point that being here first doesn't mean anything. I mean, does the first Bedouin who arrives at an oasis own the oasis? No. European settlers are the ones who developed this country. They built towns and cities. They established the nation on a political and economic foundation. They created this widespread opportunity and this widespread prosperity. I think I speak for immigrants here. We didn't come to the America the Native Americans created. If the Native Americans had continued to run the show, I would still be back in India. The reason that immigrants like me came to America is to be part of the country that the original settlers created here. That's the America that we're grateful for.